So the other night, Jen and I were watching a TV show, one of the shows that we like, a science fiction series called Silo. If you watch Silo, I'm only going to spoil things in the very vaguest of terms, very minor spoilers. But the show focuses on a woman who's trying to unravel some mysteries, let's say that. And she has all kinds of obstacles in her way, people trying to stop her. And in the last moments of the season finale, it looks like the bad guys have won. And you're kind of wondering how the story can even continue. But then, in a stunning moment, the camera pulls back and reveals that the storyline we've been following is actually only part of a much larger story. And it changes everything that we thought we knew about the show. Like, it's mind-blowing, right? I love moments like that in movies, TV shows, when you realize, hey, there's a lot more to this story than it appeared at first. Well, in this series, we've been following the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. And we have seen him go from the privileged, pampered, favorite teenage son of his dad, which made him hated by his brothers. And then they hated him even more because of these crazy dreams that he had that seemed to indicate that his whole family would one day bow down to him. And they hated him so much that they sold him into slavery in Egypt. But God was with Joseph when he was a slave. And Joseph eventually worked his way up to the rank of head servant of a prominent man in Egypt, only to be falsely accused of making advances on the master's wife and being thrown into prison. But even in prison, God was with Joseph. He was given more and more responsibility, and God gave him the ability to correctly interpret the dreams of his fellow prisoners, which eventually led to the opportunity to do the same for Pharaoh, the head honcho in Egypt. Well, Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph, he made him his second in command. And just like that, Joseph's life changed completely. Like, what a turnaround. And it seems like at that point, the story of Joseph has a happy ending, and they all lived happily ever after. But then the camera starts pulling back, and we realize this isn't about Joseph at all. There's a much bigger story at play. Today, we wrap up our series called Acts of God. It's been all about the question of suffering. Why an all-powerful, loving God would allow us to go through it. And there's no easy answer to that, but as we've seen, God is always working, even and maybe especially through times that we would see as suffering. And when we walk through times of suffering in faith, like Joseph did, I think we bring glory to God. Our own faith is strengthened and matured, and there are often also other factors and purposes in play as well that we don't even see at the time. God sees the big picture in a way we just can't, because we're not God. So the question is, how do we walk through suffering in faith? Well, as we've seen in this series from Joseph's life, I think we need to press on. I think we need to keep our integrity. I think we need to be patient. And today, as we talk about how it all comes together, we'll see that we also need to look for God's hand. We're going to pick up the story in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, starting in chapter 42. When we left off last time, Joseph has explained Pharaoh's dream to him. Egypt was about to experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. But Joseph has been given the job by Pharaoh to collect about a fifth of the grain produced during the good years and to hold it back in reserve so that Egypt would have plenty of food, even in the years of famine. And so now when we pick the story back up, the good years, those 7 years, they have come and gone, and the famine years have arrived. Joseph is still second in command of Egypt. He's married. He has a couple of kids. But here's the thing. The famine doesn't just affect Egypt. Back in Canaan, old Jacob, aka Israel, and his other 11 sons and their families are starting to feel their bellies rumble as well. So Genesis 42, starting with verse 1. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" I love that. Like, what's the matter with you morons? Don't just stand there. He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So Jacob's family's in trouble. There's just not enough food. And things are getting kind of desperate. But they've heard there's food down in Egypt thanks to all this reserved grain from the years of abundance, thanks to the program that Joseph ran. So Jacob, he sends his 10 oldest sons to go get some grain in Egypt. Now, this is not just a trip to the grocery store. It's about 150 miles each way, and there were no freeways back then. Jacob does not send Benjamin, the youngest of his sons, and the only other son, besides Joseph, of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. So Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother. Because Jacob is afraid, he's lost Joseph, he's afraid something's going to happen to Benjamin as well. See, he's still playing favorites. But verse 6. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, and the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now, it's been over 20 years by this point since Joseph has last seen his brothers. He is no longer the little teenage kid they bullied. This time, Joseph has all the power. And he is like dressed like an Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian, right? They don't recognize him. But Joseph knows them. They say time heals all wounds. No, it doesn't. Not always. Like, I love the type of friendships where you can go a long time without seeing each other, and then when you get back together, you can pick it up right where you left off. In fact, today, some of our best friends are here from Indianapolis, and we've not lived in the same place for 5 years now. But when our two families get together, it's almost like no time has passed at all. On the other hand, this is true. This week, I was contacted by somebody that I had not heard from in over 5 years. And let's just say things did not end well with them. It was extremely contentious, a very difficult situation. Now, I've forgiven this person. I have moved on. But hearing from them kind of out of the blue still brought up some of those old feelings. By itself, at least, time does not heal all wounds. And so I'm sure that seeing his brothers again brought many of those same emotions to the surface for Joseph. But he does something interesting. Joseph decides to test his brothers. He wants to see if they've changed at all. And I'm going to condense this slightly because it's a long story with lots of like twists and turns. Read Genesis 42 through 45 if you want the whole thing. But he accuses them of being spies. You're trying to see where Egypt is unprotected. Well, they deny it. They insist, we're only here to buy food. And as he questions them, they tell him, we're all part of one family. We're 12 brothers. Well, the youngest is back home. And yeah, there's another brother who's no more. And Joseph is like, okay, prove it. Bring that youngest brother back here. You're going to take the grain back to your family this time, but one of you has to stay here until you bring your youngest brother here as proof that you're not spies. And don't try to buy grain again unless you do that. And then verse 21. They said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. So Joseph hears his brothers talking. He thinks apparently they've been doing some thinking, some soul searching in the last 20 years. And apparently they feel some guilt and regret over what they did to Joseph. And that realization moves him to tears. Okay, to make a long story slightly shorter, the brothers do go home, minus Simeon, and they tell their dad, Jacob, what happened. And he's like, well, I'm sorry about Simeon, but no, you are not taking Benjamin to Egypt. Hard pass on that. And so that's the way it is for a while. But eventually, guess what? They run out of grain again. The famine's still going on. And so Jacob tells his sons, well, I guess you're going to have to go back to Egypt to get some more grain. But then Judah, one of the sons, explains, that Egyptian governor guy was pretty clear that we have to bring Benjamin with us if he's going to sell us any more grain. So let us take him with us. I personally guarantee his safety. And so Father Jacob reluctantly agrees. So the brothers head back to Egypt with Benjamin this time. Joseph does sell them more grain. He's very moved and excited to see Benjamin. But when they are packing up the grain for the brothers, he also has his servant secretly hide his own personal silver cup, which is very valuable, in Benjamin's sack of grain. Okay, so the brothers are getting ready to leave, and then Joseph is like, wait a minute, how dare one of you steal my cup? Whoever stole it must stay here as a slave. So they look in each one of the sacks, one by one, starting with the oldest all the way down to the youngest, and of course, it's found in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers are like, oh no. But then Judah, true to his word, he gets up and he makes a big speech to Joseph about how going home without Benjamin would kill their father. And he, Judah, offers to become Joseph's slave in Benjamin's place. He says, so please, my lord, let me stay here as a slave instead of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. For how can I return to my father if the boy is not with me? I couldn't bear to see the anguish this would cause my father. Well, Joseph is so moved, once again, by this act of sacrifice, that he starts weeping so loudly they can hear him like all over the building. He kicks all of his servants and everybody else out of the room except the brothers. And then he finally reveals his identity to them. Chapter 45 now, verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Yeah, I bet they were. I mean, they were already guilt-stricken over what they'd done to him 22 years before, and now Joseph has all the power in the situation. I mean, they were probably afraid he was going to get even, to get his revenge. To be honest, they kind of had it coming, didn't they? Like, even as a reader, maybe we're kind of like rooting for Joseph to get some kind of payback, besides these mind games that he's been playing with them. Because we tend to like stories like that, in which the good guys get their revenge and the bad guys get what's coming to them. At the end, they get their comeuppance. Have you noticed like how many movies or books or other stories have some kind of revenge element to them? Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. It's satisfying to see justice being served. And I think part of the reason we find it so satisfying is because we know that in real life, it doesn't always work out that way. Because sometimes the bad guys seem to get away with it. And even as we're talking about suffering, some of the hardship we experience in this life comes at the hands of other people. And they may or may not seem to suffer any consequences for it. And that's just not fair. And that can even make our own suffering seem worse. Like, they don't even care what they did to me. But here I am dealing with lifelong, in some cases, emotional or physical repercussions because of it. It is just not fair. Now, while that is certainly true, I think it's important to remember that even if people seem not to suffer any consequences for their own sinful actions, doesn't mean they don't. Like, you don't see everything. You don't know what's going on inside their heart. Maybe, for example, they're racked with guilt and shame, which is its own special brand of suffering. Maybe there are other consequences that you don't see down the road in their lives. And that's not to mention the fact that God is the righteous judge. He sees. He knows. And the Bible says that every person in the world is in one of two categories. Either they've been forgiven by the blood of Jesus, and they'll be able to live forever in perfection with him because their sins have been wiped away. Or they're going to have to pay the price for their own sin. And that price is steep. So really, people don't just get away with the bad or the evil things that they do. But let me suggest there is something even better than a good revenge story. And that is a story of grace and mercy. And that's the path that Joseph chooses. Here's what happens next. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Joseph goes on to say that there are still 5 years left of famine of the 7 years. Things are not going to get better for a while. And so what they ought to do, the whole family, all the brothers and the wives and the children and the grandchildren, which is about 70 people in all, should move down there to Egypt. And Pharaoh himself makes the arrangements to bring everybody there. And he sees to it that Joseph's family is given land in one of the best parts of Egypt, the best part of town. And so Joseph's family, the family of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, the ones that God had said he would build up into a great nation, and one day all people on earth would be blessed through them. They come to Egypt, where they have enough to eat. And they have conditions in which they could thrive. And thrive they did. It was in Egypt that this group of people grew from just Israel's family to the nation of Israel. They spent over 400 years in Egypt in total. Eventually, years later, they were enslaved by the Egyptians, by a Pharaoh who didn't know anything about Joseph and felt threatened by this big people group. But that's another story. God worked through Joseph and his position of power in Egypt to provide for the people of Israel, so that the big story of God's master plan to save people from sin could continue to unfold. And while the brothers were groveling before him, bowing down before him, I bet Joseph remembered those dreams he had when he was a kid. His whole family bowing down to him. But you know what? It turns out those dreams were not about how great Joseph was. Joseph was extremely faithful in difficult circumstances. He's a model for us in that way. But that meant that God used him to save his family and ultimately play a big part in God's overall plan. God blessed Joseph for his faithfulness, absolutely. And God blesses us for our faithfulness, absolutely. But it wasn't as much about what God did for Joseph as it was about what God did through Joseph. Joseph, for his part, even face to face with his brothers after 22 years, he had a deep enough faith that he was able to see God's hand at work through all of it. And so he was able to say to them, you sold me as a slave in Egypt, but it really wasn't you who sent me here. It was God. Years later, after their father Jacob died, the brothers were afraid that Joseph still held a grudge and that he was going to try to do something to them. And so Joseph made it even more clear that he forgave them and that he saw God's hand at work. He said in a very famous moment, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. So that's our fourth and final answer to the question, how can we walk through times of suffering in faith? We press on, we keep our integrity, we're patient, and we look for God's hand. God is working. There are going to be seasons of suffering in our lives. That's just going to happen. We're promised that. And sometimes they are very intense. And usually, our impulse, our instinct, when we're in those times, is we just want the pain to end. Just make it stop. I just want things to be better. And that's very understandable. But if we are faithful through the pain, we can see that God has been working through all of it. He has strengthened and matured our own faith. He may also have blessed us and rewarded us for our faith in remarkable ways, like Joseph experienced. But even more, he may have worked, or he may be working through us to accomplish his will. Like, just for starters, maybe others have watched you in your suffering, and you stayed faithful. And so when they go through that same sort of thing, they know how to navigate those challenges without losing their faith. Maybe what seems like suffering at the time is actually God rearranging people into the positions they need to be in so that more people can receive help in their time of need, or so that more people can be introduced to Jesus. To me, this concept is a game changer. This is the camera pulling back at the end of the season. When you go through suffering of any kind, learning to pray, not just, God, please end my pain. There's nothing wrong with that prayer. But also, God, show me how you're going to use this for your glory to help other people. That kind of perspective shift changes everything. What does God want to do through you to help others? Paul writes about this in his letter to the Romans in a very famous and widely misunderstood verse. He says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Okay, now this is not saying that God causes bad things to happen, that everything that happens is good, and it is not saying that things will always work out the way we want them to. It is saying that for people who belong to Jesus, who have been called according to his purpose, God is always working through the good times and the bad. And he is working for good, for the ultimate good, which is to make us more like Jesus and to impact this world for him. So look for God's hand at work. Like, what good can God accomplish through your circumstances? What good can God do, not just for you, but through you? Perhaps part of the reason you've experienced what you have is so that you can help others who go through the same thing. Or maybe their circumstances are very different from yours, but you can still help them walk through their season of suffering in faith. We're not God. God sees the big picture in a way we just can't as humans. And that means we don't always get to really know why we face the suffering we face. But that's not the key to know why. The key is, when we do face suffering, to walk through it in faith, to press on, to keep our integrity, to be patient, and to look for God's hand. And I believe if we do that, our seasons of greatest trial can actually lead to our greatest seasons of triumph. You know, as much as we may crave justice, and for people who do wrong to get what's coming to them, it's important to remember that we have all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. We're selfish. We mistreat others. We think we know better than our Creator how to do life. We might think, well, what I did isn't as bad as what that person did. Well, all sin is sin, and all sin separates us from God. All sin demands a price to be paid. And as a result, if we all got what we really deserved, there'd be no hope for any of us. We'd spend eternity separated from God in a suffering that has no end. But remember what Judah did for his brother Benjamin. It's interesting that it's Judah. He offered himself in place of Benjamin to pay the penalty that Benjamin owed, or at least they thought he owed. And about 1900 years later, it was a descendant of Judah who did the same thing for all of humanity. Jesus offered himself up as the atoning sacrifice, the payment for all of the sin of all of the world. He paid the price we owed for our sin. And because he did that, everyone who places their faith and trust in him has hope. We can have our relationship with God restored now and forever. For those who belong to Jesus, the promise is there really will come a permanent end to all suffering, all pain. That's the big picture. That's the grand story that God is telling, of which Joseph was a part, of which Jesus was the central part, and of which we are also a part. And that's why we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose.